Good afternoon. I'm Mark Greenfield, and as chairman of the Associated Student Speakers Program, I'd like to welcome all of you to another program in our noon lecture series. Today's guest is a graduate of Harvard University. His most recent teaching position was at San Fernando Valley State College, where he taught in the Department of History. He's a former president of the Los Angeles Board of Education. He's presently a member of the LA Board of Education and a candidate for Max Rafferty's seat as State Superintendent of Public Instruction. It's with pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Julian Nava.
Thank you very much, Mark. You neglected to point out that Mr. Rafferty is our unofficial campaign chairman. One of our greatest assets. I feel a little uneasy speaking on the campus here at UCLA, since I know that this student body may very well be solidly lined up behind its brilliant alumnus, Max Rafferty. But in case it isn't, I'm particularly honored to be your guest during this week because it is Earth Week, a time when we are concerned about informing our fellow citizens about the dangers of pollution. In a way, I'm trying to practice ecological science. I'm engaged day and night in trying to get rid of some political pollution. You see, I want Max Rafferty retired. Now, you may not think this qualifies as pollution, but believe me, if we can just keep Max's mouth closed for a couple of days, I think that you'd see the temperature drop a few degrees, and if we could somehow manage to keep him quiet for 2 days, we would have shut down the primary source of pollution emanating from Sacramento, at least one of the primary sources. But let's talk now about something that concerns many of us, indeed probably most of the people in Los Angeles, namely the teachers' strike. Let's find out why we have a crisis in Los Angeles and other school districts in the state, and what officials are doing to correct the situation. First of all, one could fairly ask, why did it take a state mediation service to get the striking teachers in Los Angeles and representatives of the city's unified school district to sit down with one another? Was it because the issues were so complex that it took state troubleshooters to unravel the demands? Was it because the two sides could not negotiate without a third party keeping score at the bargaining table? No, not really. It is nothing more than a face-saving device for the school district. The teachers have always wanted to sit down and negotiate. It has been our acting superintendent of schools, with the support of the conservative members on the Board of Education, who shut off the talks. Our highly paid professional negotiator was instructed to stop negotiating with representatives of the teachers group unless they first went back to work. And those are currently his instructions. Although once again, I made a motion, an ill-fated motion on the board yesterday to give him flexibility. In short, when such instructions were issued to our negotiator is when I intervened, for I am elected at large in this school district and can operate as one among peers on the Board of Education. Somebody had to break the ice. So when I called public attention to the fact that it was irresponsible to hire a negotiator who was not negotiating, my actions forced the school district to seek federal mediation. I took independent action, and I talked to teachers myself. I determined then, and I still maintain, that the essential issues the teachers are demanding in Los Angeles can and could be worked out by reasonable city school district officials sitting down at the bargaining table with the representatives of our teachers group. When the administrators and board members realized that they had painted themselves into a corner and that they were in an untenable position, for students disapproved of the school district's position, citizens in the vast majority did, city officials, state officials also did. They jumped for an out that I had suggested a week before. In this case, a federal mediator. But as I'm sure some of you have learned by now, federal mediation was declined, for there is an understanding that state mediation must be requested first before federal mediation can be made available. And so now your own highly regarded Professor Benjamin Aaron has been mutually accepted by United Teachers of Los Angeles and by the school district board as a mediator. If this mediator can effect a settlement, I will obviously support such an action. For the main object of my actions to date has been to instill a note of urgency to this matter. We have a good group here. However, there happen to be 640,000 pupils. 640,000 pupils that are being shortchanged in their education. Every hour, the strike continues. And it is now towards the end of its second week. Yet I find even board members adopting a ho-hum attitude, throwing up their hands and saying there is very little that can be done, while some lay plans to not just break the strike, but to break the union, to levy exorbitant financial claims against the union, and force teachers to crawl back to school on their hands and knees to highly probable campuses where they run the risk of being blacklisted and suffering professional effects indefinitely unless there were a contract signed that were to eliminate repression for those teachers who have taken this stand. I am personally prepared to work around the clock if necessary to help resolve this strike. And whatever agreement is mutually acceptable, I am positive is going to require legislative action. And I promise to help bring about legislative action to see that this strike isn't repeated next year. One of the surprises, however, in this strike is to see the gaspers it brings out. You know the gaspers, they respond to every proposal with a gasp. Their only contribution to this strike is to prolong it with indecision, inaction, and inattentiveness. I don't have to name them. You can see them leaping out of their newspaper headlines each day. They think the strike is terrible, with a gasp. How could the teachers do this to us? Does that mean that somebody doesn't think the strike is terrible? I don't know anyone who likes a strike. They wish the state would help. Does that imply that there is anyone in the local system who does not think the state should help? We don't need this kind of wishy-washy reaction from supposedly responsible officials. Incidentally, this strike has set a very interesting precedent for the future. And this precedent has been lost on most because of the rhetoric. It's the first strike in memory where labor was making some demands for its consumer instead of just itself. Dwell on that for a moment. Those 67 pages that some people have jumped to conclude are ridiculous, and which some irresponsible people have quickly applied a price tag of $1.5 billion to, while admitting beforehand that they couldn't understand them. They somehow were able to calculate their supposed costs. The major issues in this strike are matters that would benefit school children. If you take away a carpenter's hammer, he can probably fashion another tool to pound a nail. If you take away a screwdriver, he can probably do the same. But if you strip the carpenter of his hammer and his screwdriver and most of his other tools, how can he possibly practice his craft? And at the risk of what might sound like exaggeration, thus it is with Los Angeles schools. In some schools, teachers have supplied their own pamphlets, their own test papers, their own paper supplies because there aren't enough in the school supply room. The average teacher, we understand, on the basis of those polled that are probably representative, spends about $250 a year for supplies for his respective classroom. The teachers have watched reduced budgets cut into their tools of their professional craft. The first year I was on the board, we cut $14 million from the budget, and it hurt. The second year I was on the board, we cut $24 million from the budget, and that hurt twice as much. More than twice, because it was on top of the previous cut. And this year, as I'm sure you are aware, we are in the process of cutting about $42 million from the budget. And if the governor's tax reform program were to pass, that cut would have to be increased to approximately $56 million. Books have become dog-eared and worn. Libraries in the schools provide less and less resources. Class sizes have sneaked up 1, 2, 3 per average class size per year. And teachers without tenure have shrugged their shoulders and moved off into new professions. For depending on parts of the school district, we have turnover rates as high as 35%. And we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars recruiting teachers, close to a third of which we know will only work with us during the first year. And on we go to hire the other thousands and hope that it's the better two-thirds that stay. Oh, granted, our administrators have complained. They've even made numerous trips to Sacramento, and I've accompanied them on some occasions. Most have failed, however, to persuade the governor to keep his 1966 campaign promise to lift the level of state support for local education to 50%, which it is supposed to be at right now. These efforts, however, have not done much good because administrators, honestly, don't have the force or the courage, nor are they able or willing to use the means to apply political pressure on a political creature. State support in Los Angeles, I'm sure some of you may know, is below the state average of 34% rather than 50%. Los Angeles schools currently get 28% of our local budget supplied by the state. And it's the difference between 28 and 50 that has progressively begun to dismantle our school programs by budget cuts such as those that I told you I've had to participate in since I've been on the board. In the meantime, the load has been shifted to the property taxpayer locally, and I'm sure you are not surprised to hear that local taxpayers simply are not approving increases in their property taxes. Where has Governor Reagan's campaign promise gone? Gone, I suspect, with other campaign promises about his friendliness to education. Now, granted, I am a candidate for the nonpartisan office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. Nonpartisan. And I just made what sounds like a partisan statement. It wasn't. He's the governor. Considering the disastrous path which Governor Reagan and his sidekick, Max Rafferty, have taken, I can't believe that any citizen concerned with the welfare of California's 5 million school children could, in good conscience, support either the governor or Rafferty, even if they were Republicans. These two men are not just participants in the dismantling of California's education system, from the elementary all the way up through our once great university system. They are the prime architects of a type of war on education. Yes, it's a war, and most tragic of all, the victims of this senseless war are young people, those least able to defend themselves. Children that will be in the first grade only one time in their life, in the second grade only one time in their life, and so forth, losing opportunities which can never be recouped again. This strike in Los Angeles did not come about overnight. It started years ago. This simply has been the breaking point. This was a point where teachers, without taking sides on the strike, said they were fed up with perpetuating a system which was turning out youngsters with lower achievements in a system that is demanding higher degrees and learning skills. Administrators comfortable in their easy chairs and fat salaries, with the protection of tenure, have learned to shuffle papers and live with it. But teachers who had to look at the end results in the classroom every day have decided to take a different course. This, as a television commentator pointed out last weekend, may have been the first strike in history where the strikers were demanding considerations for a third party as a condition for returning to work. It makes little difference to a teacher, after all, whether he lectures to 25 or 50. I personally can't sense the difference. I might as well lecture to 500 as to 50. But it makes a lot of difference to the student who is beyond personal attention in the larger class, somewhere beyond about 25. No matter how badly he needs the attention, he simply cannot obtain it from a teacher who finds it impossible to do more than simply perhaps learn the names of his pupils and then address the mass. As in any labor dispute, there have been gross attempts by both of the polarized sides to misinform the public. One candidate for statewide office, State Senator John Harmer, suggested this week that the teachers wanted exclusive bargaining rights as a condition for returning to work. This was a lie. If the candidate who holds state office now had only the integrity to lift up a telephone and ask, he would have discovered the teachers do not want exclusive bargaining rights. They realize that this is unattainable under present law. But there are those about us who, despite the seriousness of the crisis, would do nothing more than seize partisan advantage and use this strike to perpetuate their own careers at the expense of our school children. And I am not sparing either party. This strike was and is negotiable. It didn't take a mediator. All it took was a courage to sit down with the other side and work out the details. The school board agrees with the teachers' contention that the state has left Los Angeles holding the bag. These people are not reasonable. Let's hope that current negotiations point the way to ending the dispute and sending our children back to school. But what about the future? We must look farther ahead than simply the spring of 1970. Los Angeles needs more than emergency aid if it is to look beyond the current school year, unless we want to go through this whole thing again and again and again. I have submitted some proposals which I think may point the way to a more efficient administration of local education throughout the state. At the same time, bring about a better public attitude towards schools. First of all, I have suggested that a professional management study be made of this Los Angeles school district. The public deserves to know the level of efficiency of the school district which it supports. Such a study would also do much to clear the air and help restore public confidence. Once the suggestions from such a study were put into effect by the school board. In my own study, I discovered the city school district is honeycombed with nests of bureaucrats at high salaries and with vague responsibilities. Over 200 of our school district officials draw salaries in excess of what we pay elected officials in city, county, or even state government. Our superintendent earns far more than the governor of the state of California. Let's learn more about these administrators. Let's learn what they're supposed to do. And more important, let's find out if they are doing their job. Is that so unreasonable? That taxpayers have a right to know. The public has a right to know. And you, already and in the future paying taxes, also have a right to know. Secondly, I have proposed that we eliminate tenure for our school administrators in favor of a contract based on performance. We simply can't afford the luxury of empire building around non-productive administrators in this time of crisis. School administrators who pass on their own, protect their own, and behave like a priesthood that is incapable of committing sin. Thirdly, that applies for colleges too, by the way, even UCLA. Thirdly, I have proposed that we increase the professional staff for the school board so that the board does not have to rely on the professional bureaucracy when it seeks to have a question asked that may be embarrassing to the bureaucracy. We've got to maintain and establish more independence for school board members. As it stands now, some of you may not know, each board member, since I was elected to the board and as a result of my insistence, each board member now has his own secretary. One person. And yet each of us is elected at large from a constituency of about 3 million people. city councilmen have 12, 13, 14 employees for a 15th of the city. I think that if we support boards, give them the means to do their job, many of our problems can be more readily resolved. For a bureaucracy like ours, with over 45,000 employees that are hired every year, must be made to work better. These are still local issues and don't answer questions that really lie ahead for the state in general. It's my belief that we have crossed the road into the future within our state and our country. It's my belief that for some inexplainable reason, we are still holding on to educational views that are about a century old. The techniques of education, K through, kindergarten through the PhD, by the way, must somehow be brought into the 21st century. One of the fastest ways to effect that in California is to kick out the incumbent superintendent, who expresses the best thinking of the early 19th century. But you know, McGuffey's reader just won't do it anymore. Besides, that's after Rafferty's age anyway. Perhaps we may even have to throw out our current sacred, self-contained classroom. Maybe even our textbooks, as we know them, are due for revolutionary change. All I am really trying to say is that we must head into the future remembering that it is time for an open mind and search for new concepts. We have to learn that our students are actually capable of learning far more information in a more brief period of time than we presently assume. Cite but one example. Your brains are probably constructed by virtue of the fact that you are here to read in excess of 2,000 words a minute with greater pleasure and with a higher rate of comprehension and retention than your probable average of maybe 300 to 400. And I think most of you would distribute about 350 words a minute. Time yourself. Quiz yourself. If you haven't done it before, you can't say that you haven't heard the suggestion after I've just made it. The reason that you can't read faster is that public education has probably hindered more than it has helped you. And the same is pretty much true today. Why then don't we think in terms of speeding up the curriculum and comply with the new capability we know young people have for learning? We know that we must prepare students for skills in new fields. Why not then begin to weed out the irrelevant subject material in much of today's courses and replace it with courses that we know students should have? That's the kind of forward leadership I promise as superintendent of public instruction. Now let's take a look at some other subjects that are also of interest. One of my chief opponents for the superintendency of public instruction says that he is satisfied with separate but equal. He says, in his opinion, that a black or a brown child does not have to sit next to a white in order to get an equal education. In fact, it's degrading for the minority student. I don't believe that. I'm equally concerned with the majority student and the effects on society. I don't think that separate and equal are acceptable. And I'm shocked that anyone should feel that separate and equal will produce quality education. I say that we will not have either equality or quality education until we integrate our schools, and that goes for Los Angeles as well as Pasadena. Now, many are confused over the Gittleson decision. However, Los Angeles is a peculiarly shaped school district. I believe that integration orders should transcend one school district and its lines to include broader areas in which, to ease the mechanical burden of integration, we simply must think in terms of counties rather than just one school district. There is no reason in the world to ship a student from San Pedro to the San Fernando Valley when, by skipping existing school district lines, that same student could be moved into the Palos Verdes Peninsula or to Beverly Hills. As State Superintendent of Public Instruction, I would work for a top priority for removing segregation in our schools rather than to impede it. After all, the effects of de facto segregation are just the same as de jure segregation, and it is the pervasive effects that I seek to end regardless of the cause. Now let's take a quick look at finance. Some of you are already paying taxes into education with investments in land, housing, or the sales tax, and other things in property that you have. All of you eventually will be contributing to pay the cost of public education, in the future paying for the education that you have received before. You deserve an even-handed distribution of tax money to support your schools. I believe the burden should be removed from the property owner, but I don't subscribe to the governor's tax reform program, which would merely shift the burdens to the sales tax, which, as we all know, is regressive because it hits the poor harder than the rich. I propose that we examine those sacred cows, those pillars of our society, which we exempt from paying their fair share of taxes. I urge you to listen. I propose that we make such vested interests as oil, banks, gas, and public utilities, as well as insurance companies that don't know what to do with their profits, pay a more equitable share of state taxes. In some states in our union, rather than give the petroleum industry, for one, tax privileges, they are charged severance taxes, if only in hope, poetically, that as they rapidly draw out petroleum from the soil, which will never again be replaced, these funds be devoted to education in hopes that we might help subsequent generations figure out a way how they're going to lubricate things without oil. The governor simply doesn't understand the feeling of the people, and he often misrepresents it when he thinks he does. In this latest school crisis, he has leaned heavily on the factor that Los Angeles voters turned down a tax override. What he doesn't seem to understand is that the vote was not against schools. It was only a way to get the educational costs off the backs of home property taxes. But even if he didn't understand the true issue, are we to believe that we have a governor in office which would sit by and fiddle as he watched public education dismantled? This past week, the governor showed emotion over the tragic killing of a university student in Santa Barbara. We share his concern with that tragic and unnecessary act of violence. But how can that same governor be so unemotional watching the future of 640,000 children hurt right before his very eyes? We need to convince this administration in Sacramento that education is the major business of state government. They can pat one another on the back and build fancy roads to some ranch owned by a fellow legislator. But the main business of government on the state level must be the support of public education. It's in the state constitution. I must keep reminding. I am shocked at the way education is given such short shrift today in Sacramento. The budget, with the exception of educational monies, is fought and adopted, and then what is left up is divided for public schools. Education must have the chief priority in this state, kindergarten through universities. Education is an investment in the future of this state. Our legislators must know that California's per capita income is well above other states in the Union. If we were considered a nation, we'd be about the 5th wealthiest nation in the world if we took California as a nation by itself. It must also know that the reason the per capita income is so high is, after all, due to the great educational base built in this state by visionary governors like Earl Warren, Goodwin Knight, and Governor Brown. Yet today, much of this progress is threatened by a short-sighted administration of anti-education bureaucrats. Let one student throw a rock on the campus, and the governor will stand ready to raid the Treasury to enforce martial law. Let 640,000 school children miss out on their entire educational experience for several weeks, and the governor retreats to his rented executive mansion and cries he is powerless to act. Mr. Rafferty, when asked regarding the problems in Los Angeles, said, "I don't know." He was asked about the question of excessive administration and the malfunctioning of administration. He said, "I don't think anyone knows." And then he went on in his glorious rampant rhetoric to say, "But, you know, Stanford University, if you'll forgive the reference, is a very respected institution of higher education, and I have asked the Dean of the School of Education to commission 2 bright young graduate students to do doctoral dissertations on educational administration, and when they have finished, I will have something to say." When asked, "Are they working on the dissertations?" he said, "Well, I think so, the last time I heard." It wasn't really that long ago that I was in your midst, walking the halls of East Los Angeles Junior College, then Pomona, and finally Harvard, before I ventured out as a Fulbright scholar and have had a number of very interesting experiences in different countries that give me a perspective on education in California I would not have had otherwise. It's not a pretty world, you know. It used to be. It's a dirtier and a more dangerous world that we are turning over to youth. I had a decision to make, to conclude. I could have slipped through writing books for other scholars to read, or chosen the quiet life of a tenured professor, or combined both. But like many of you, I wasn't satisfied with the world as it is. I want to change it. I want to make a contribution. I want equal education for every child now. Apropos of Earth Week, I want to see man protect his environment now. I want to see political action substituted for rampant rhetoric now. I want to change the course of education for California's 5 million school children now. I want to see this great university protected from those that would ruin it now. I share your sense of mission. I share also your sense of commitment. give me your support. Let's try to breathe new life into California education. I know that together we can do the job. Thank you. Questions?
Dr. Nava has time to entertain questions. I'd appreciate it not to be stuffy and formal, but just so that everyone can hear, if you'd use the floor mics on either side of the room if you have questions for Dr. Nava. And if you just go to a mic and shoot, I'm sure he'll be able to handle an answer.
I'm curious what the chances for any cuts in administration are right now, and also what's the state of the community control experiment in South Central that started a few years ago?
All right, there are two questions. Is there any chance of cutting administration now, and what are the results of community control in southeast Los Angeles? We are making now drastic cuts in administration, only as a result of the overall budget crisis. These are cuts that we should have made several years back. Unfortunately, I was on the minority of the board when, in making the cuts, the majority of the board decided to reduce the number of positions and assign remaining people on the basis of seniority. Frankly, seniority is not the most effective criterion to use. I argued hard for selecting the remaining administrators on the basis of their competence, even if they were 10 or 15 years younger than people who have floated up because they were lighter. Now, we have a number of pilot programs in this school district. Actually, it literally is true. All of them have started since I was on the board. Not all of them happen to have been my idea. But I've been very active in pursuing some and have championed a couple myself. There is good change in this respect, to give local communities some involvement in decision-making at the schools. What I've argued for, we don't quite have, and I think we're moving in that direction. As briefly as I can, not community advisory committees, which we presently have, but community school councils. Community school councils, comprised of not just parents, but representatives from labor, church groups, political parties, business, to meet with the principal and plan the course of education in that school according to state statute and board guidelines, in which really the principal would be like a superintendent rather than a king. We're moving in that direction. However, it's unfortunate we haven't moved more rapidly.
If you really mixed up all the children and not put them in their neighborhood schools, do you think that English as a second language for Spanish-speaking children would be helped or hindered by this?
Initially, if you bring about integration with respect to Spanish-speaking children in Los Angeles, or let's say Chinese-speaking children in San Francisco, pardon me, I'm not sick, it's just simply a raw throat from talking too much. My wife says, Julian, why don't you shut up for a couple of days and then you can resume the campaign with a better throat. But the primary is June 2nd and we don't have the time. Initially, there would be a loss, but it wouldn't be a loss of very much because we were doing so little. I think by the same token that there are ways we know of making instruction available to children who would then be, by definition, a minority in all of the schools rather than attending schools that are 75 or 80% Chicano kids, you see. This could be provided for. Unfortunately, however, there is a considerable resentment against integration in much of East Los Angeles because they fear that only now are they beginning to get some modest measure of community control or community participation, which would be lost with integration. But honestly, in the long run, when I think of the 21st century and a shrinking world, an ever more interdependent world, we have no choice but to provide an integrated education, for anything else is truly inferior.
how do you propose to measure the efficiency of our Los Angeles school system, and how can you inform the public, the parents, of your performance?
I think that while, or in the course of demands by teachers that they get collective bargaining rights, which I champion, they should also be willing to give up tenure. We've got an awful lot of dead wood in the teaching ranks, and far too many of them are department chairmen. Now, I'm talking about public schools for the most part, for it's true that almost universally in colleges and universities, department chairmen are selected by some form of peer group judgment, almost universally. Now, if you remove tenure, immediately you have a complete psychological change, and you can just simply try to ascertain which classes given by which teachers, taking into account other factors, are not achieving the educational goals, and then give assistance to that teacher if assistance seems to be what is needed, if their pupils are reading a year or 2 years behind reading level, or transfer them various grades of steps to bring teachers to where they realize that they're simply going to have to produce more. But you must, by the same token, reduce class size, give them the supplies they need, and the supporting staff. Because right now, we frankly have a chicken and the egg situation.
Dr. Nava, I'm Tom Robichon. I'm in the Graduate School of Education on the faculty. In my question, I'd like to go beyond some of these proposals for improving the schools and go beyond and think about what's going to happen after the strike, even if the teachers were to win all their demands. You made the statement that you said the students are being shortchanged during this strike, and I'm not so sure but what they're at least equally shortchanged when there isn't a strike. And I wonder if we're now not seeing, not only in Los Angeles but elsewhere, the limits to which schooling can go to answer our educational needs. To pour more money into the schools, I'm beginning to think is like washing garbage before you throw it away. What we need to do, I think, is to start thinking of alternatives to schools as a way of meeting our educational needs. That maybe we should proceed to dismantle the schools, not like the people that you point out are doing it now, not for their purposes, but for purposes of better answering these educational needs. Art Seidenbaum has a column in this morning's Times in which he hints at this, I think, when he says that people can learn from all kinds of people. They don't have to learn just from people with credentials. And I think what next needs to be said is that people can learn from all kinds of situations and not just from in schools. And I wonder if you wouldn't comment on the possibility that we could seriously proceed to find community alternatives to our education, answering our educational needs.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that by the same token, because you are in the field you are, you would grant me that since public education is a state matter, we have statutes that require the number of minutes that a pupil must be in a class and the number of days, the minimum number of days that he must be in attendance at a school, and money to a school district on ADA, average daily attendance, is based on attendance. And so while thinkers and reformers propose ways by which we could do better in education, we must, in the meantime, work with the system we have in order to persuade legislatures to change laws to give local school districts more flexibility for which they could then be held accountable. And I believe that we are entering into an era that promises a fair amount of change by virtue of the passage of Senate Bill 1, SB 1, granting school districts a considerable amount of flexibility. We have, in short, some extremely exciting and well-proven ideas about improving education. And the main problem is not just present laws, which are not to be slighted, but administrators who are reluctant to change because change is threatening to them and is an aspersion on their professional competence. And hence, you might have noticed I was kind of leaning on administration. You can't just simply say we're going to close the schools and hope that something emerges. It's going to take structuring, and it's an extremely difficult course to chart between being what I might fairly call myself a radical educational reformer in the positive sense, and working with our present laws to bring this about. Without belaboring the point, let me just give you but one brief example. We had last year an experiment, we call it an experiment, in 3 schools in the Los Angeles School District. One in the Valley, one in East LA at Chicano Elementary School, and one in the black area. So the 3 major groups in the city. We brought in bright graduate students in mathematics from Berkeley, if you'll forgive me, to teach 3rd grade pupils mathematics. At 3rd grade, they're simply beginning to learn their numbers, you know. And I was present at the opening session when these graduate students with no previous teaching experience started playing with numbers with the kids. At the end of the year, I went to see that class session. At the first session, there were 6 board members there. At the end of the class, at the end of the semester, or at the end of the year, I was the only school board member that showed up. And by the end of the year, I could not understand what the kids were doing. There were only 20 kids in the class, mind you. I could not understand what they were doing because every now and then, you know, Arabic numerals did show up. Now, although in curious configurations. And there was in my presence a professor from MIT and one from one from Caltech, and the guiding professor from Berkeley, whose graduate students in the 3 schools were doing this. When it was all over, the teacher in question left some of the work on the blackboard, and then the presiding prof proceeded to explain to school staff and the 1 school board member, for the other professors knew what was happening, and as I looked at them during the class, they were simply just plain shaking their head and going like this. The 3rd grade students were doing graduate level mathematics, and you couldn't hold them down. And there were several kids in the class that had just got to school from TJ the beginning of the year, and they had no English-speaking problems. And now I mentioned the way your computer is rigged to read faster. If you don't retain, it's probably because you're bored stiff. You're driving a Cadillac in low gear. We know these things. It's a question, however, of bringing about the instrument by which you can put them into effect. Yes.
I had a question about financing the schools. It seemed like the Times had come out with several articles in which they said that Governor Reagan and the legislature was not moving because basically because there's Proposition 8, which would give 50%, which would force the state to give 50% to or finance 50% of all state, of all schools. And there was also, but the Times came out and supported the Senate bill, I think sponsored by Moscone, I think 2 bills, which would give more money to all the state schools. And I was wondering if you could comment about this bill and also about Proposition 8 and the effect that these 2 things would have.
Okay. Proposition 8 is so far the best hope there is for sound funding for schools in California. It's the best hope there is. The governor's tax reform program is regressive. It means less money for school districts rather than more. Now, there are a number of bugs in Proposition 8. There are a number of things left unsaid. There is actually a bill already introduced into the legislature by Mr. Collier, which would implement Proposition 8. The governor and legislators in both parties, I must say, because these things are too important, are copping out. Not all, but many are copping out, and they say, we can't do anything until we find out whether Proposition 8 passes. Now, there's no reason in the world why the legislature or the governor could not propose real tax reform and a significant improvement of state support for local schools before Proposition 8. Proposition 8 simply says, among other things, the state must give no less than 50%. No less than 50%. It's not 50-50. Actually, it's my firm opinion the state should move towards something closer to 75% of support for local school districts, simply because, and you may not have heard this before, I hadn't, but I'm convinced that since the benefits of education extend beyond the district where they are received, every child, wherever he is, should not be made guilty for the income bracket of his parents, but should be assured statewide a high quality education which his parents might choose to supplement for particular interests or activities, but not to supply the basic educational program, you see. So there is much confusion over Proposition 8, and much of it has been manufactured. There's nothing to stop sound educational reform if the governor and the legislature decide to do it. Or a couple more, so the young lady and then the gentleman.
Okay. Dr. Nava, I'd like to ask a three-part question concerning integration of the LA
Why don't you
City
take one
schools.
part and then we'll give her a chance to ask hers.
Well,
All
it's
right.
just kind of real short. The first part is, because we have to have a busing program for integration, who would pay for it, the federal, state, or city? Second part, have any plans been made that could be implemented that would be just as effective as busing but less expensive?
Okay.
And also, one more. Now that there's the crisis with the teachers who want, smaller classrooms, how are they? What's going to have priority, the classroom situation or the integration? Or how's the LA City going to?
Okay, I'll try. The first one, who would pay for the costs stemming from busing? Most school districts in California already bus. There are few, if any, additional costs. High costs for busing are really peculiar to Los Angeles because of our demography and our physical extent, you see. They are not a serious cost in Pasadena, nor are they in Berkeley, nor are they in San Francisco. And although they are a high cost in rural school districts because of their territorial extent, they are not against busing. The real issue is integration. The kids are transported. The question is, what schools do you drop them off at? Now, what was the second?
Were there any other plans?
Oh, yes. There are a number of other ways of bringing about integration other than physical transportation. Again, honestly, it depends on the school district. In Pasadena, for example, most of the integration was achieved by redrawing school district attendance lines. So hypothetically, if the lines all go this way, hypothetically, you could just simply make them go this way. And it's not going to hurt kids if they have to walk 6 or 7 blocks more. Some might have to walk less. Now, you can do a number of other things too. You can pair schools. You can provide educational integrated experiences like we do in Los Angeles. Instead of having all the kids from one school go to the planetarium or Marineland or Griffith Park or what have you, the same bus, the same cost, will pick up kids from different schools, which will then be an integrated bus. And then they go to Griffith Park or the planetarium, and the kids will have an integrated school experience. And then after that, if there's a lunch, and there usually is a lunch, they'll go somewhere, and with careful planning, you can give some integrated educational experiences to kids, who may be seeing someone radically different than they are for the first time. Integration is particularly critical at the elementary grades. That's where the twig is bent. Now, in some school districts like Los Angeles, these alternate plans will only affect about 15 or 20% of the total integration need. Because by redrawing district lines, you can bring in minority students into majority schools around the perimeter of the barrio or the perimeter of the ghetto. But beyond a certain point, 13, 14, 15% minority injected into a majority school, you saturate and then resegregate. So there's really no escape in Los Angeles from transportation. Now the third question was what?
The priorities between the demands in the strike and busing. You know, the classroom.
I'm almost certain that the wage demands and the changes in working conditions and the demands of teachers for involvement in decision-making in schools will take priority, because these are considered to be the factors that immediately affect all education wherever the children are. And I cannot tell you now how much money the board will set aside for continuation of its present integration busing program. Yes, sir.
I'm a striking teacher, and that's not why I said that. I just
Fair enough.
I'm interested in the polarization that is going on as a result of the strike. It seems to me that sides are being drawn, that teachers and administrators are becoming more militant in the positions that they've chosen. There are very few fence-sitters left, and it's getting worse all the time. And I can see that in my own situation and from all the people I meet and talk to. There's going to be a hell of a lot of trouble if this strike ever ends, getting back together again and working as a unit, as an integral unit, which is so important, especially on the elementary school level.
Yeah.
And I want to know, like, there was a question over here about, is there a need for the kind of school system that we have, and shouldn't we consider others? But I want to know, do you think the school system will survive?
I'm not sure. I echo your concern for polarization. I have even heard from a number of administrators that the administrative phalanx, regiment, is beginning to crack, and that some administrators are beginning to see that negative attitudes on the part of other administrators towards the striking teachers are going to open wounds that may never be healed, and that unless something is done to make it clear that there are people on both sides of goodwill, and unless more is done to lessen the polarization, really it will be a Pyrrhic victory for both sides, for we'll have factionalized staff in so many of our schools. I think this could have been avoided, frankly, if the board and staff had moved with open hands and open heart into negotiations rather than to establish and maintain the present sine qua non, absolute condition that we won't negotiate until after you come back to school. And it was this decision which I've been fighting openly at probably irreparable damage as far as certain aspects of my relations with my fellow board members, because I honestly believe that was a tragic mistake. And I simply hope that whatever comes out of the strike, we can restore and actually vastly improve professional camaraderie in our schools. I want to thank you very much for coming. I think that it's not only been a pleasure for me and an interest to hear what you have to say, but I hope that it was of some use to you. And let me end in a very personal note. I, for one, and members of the campaign staff, are doing everything we can. We're not copping out. We're not coasting. Are you letting George do it? Whether or not there's a runoff, will be decided June 2nd, whether or not you're registered to vote. There's probably a couple of hundred people each one of you has social contact with. Stop to count. Are you at least asking questions about the issues involved in the superintendency race? Do you know what are the issues? And are you doing whatever you can do? Look at the candidates. That's all I ask. Look the candidates over. Find out what they stand for. Find out what they've done. And when you pick a candidate, then work for that candidate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.